All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our discussion this afternoon. We are here to talk about threat hunting in an FI environment, and here is our problem statement. Following a series of complaints from customers about unauthorized transactions, a financial institution has established a pattern consistent with a cyber attack. It has become evident that the transactional systems within the bank are compromised and that multiple actors spreading across international borders are potentially involved. Initial investigations are revealing a spear phishing campaign that may have utilized a vulnerability in an operating system that has now released key controls to illegitimate actors. We invite your team to prepare this institution in the midst of this shift. What are some of the best practices they should adhere to, and how do they consolidate threat intelligence feeds? Your approach should outline how our team will work collaboratively with the institution to address the shifting landscape and provide actionable intelligence. And so, with that, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Trish Villanueva, and I'm happy to be a member of the advisory board for siberXchange 3.0. Currently, I'm acting as the director of the Cybersecurity Operations Center at Scotiabank, leading our incident response, cyber threat intel, and data loss monitoring capabilities. I've had the honor of having worked in technology for over 10 years with a focus on cybersecurity for the past 8, having built security operations centers in 4 continents around the world. Joining me today, would like you to meet and re-meet, I guess, because she's already been on here, is Layla Dragonic, the Senior Information Security Analyst at TD Bank. Layla is also a member of our advisory board for Cyber Exchange. And prior to transitioning into the world of tech and security, Layla worked for the European and US nonprofit organizations that focused on peace building and social justice. She loves speaking about cybersecurity and data privacy and spends her free time trying to make technology and security more accessible to the average user. With a background in political science, she does her best to point out the important bonds between data, cybersecurity, and social justice. Thanks to a dad who was a professional soccer player by the age of 18, Layla has lived in 4 countries, 13 cities, but now calls Toronto home, which is kind of a melting pot of all the above. Welcome, Layla.
Thank you, Trish. That was lovely.
And joining us as well, as you've already heard from Mr. Matthew Belcher, is the Senior Solution Engineer for Sentinel-1 in Canada. Matthew has spent over a decade consulting customers on building networks, communications platforms, and cybersecurity. Prior to joining Sentinel-1 to support their innovative endpoint protection, he worked for industry leaders such as Cisco and Kaspersky Labs. A passionate evangelist for cybersecurity. He is a frequent speaker and panel member, as we've already seen today, helping customers understand the threat landscape and measures to defend against it. So, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining
Thanks.
us in our conversation today.
Thanks so much.
All right. So, let's start off with a couple of starting questions with our problem statement. Scary scenario for an FI, and as an incident responder myself, it's something that definitely keeps me up at night. Um, Layla, why don't we get started with your first ask?
For sure. And I think we touched upon this a little bit, Matthew, in our previous conversation about, it's a financial institution focused day. So the question that was asked was, what makes financial organizations different? And during that talk show, we kind of talked about the importance of financial institutions, and why they get attacked so often, why the focus is on them. But is there anything that makes financial institutions different for you as clients, or when it comes to threat hunting in financial institutions, as opposed to, for example, other software providers?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. When I first meet most organizations, like on the first intro, I sort of assess the organization's situation by looking at 3 key elements: target, complexity, and exposure. And if you look at those 3 things, there's no industry that has more exposure than finance. There's no industry that is more targeted than finance. And complexity comes, with the nature of the business. Millions of transactions per minute, and all of that responsiveness that's required, trying to keep things locked down. I mean, so yeah, I think beyond the differences in like businesses, from one to the other, and the end goal of productivity and profitability that varies from one industry to the next. I think when we look at it from a cybersecurity perspective, what makes finance different is if you look at those three categories, they're probably number one across the board.
Oh yeah, for sure. But on top of that, is there anything about the way financial institutions are set up that makes threat hunting more difficult for you? Or is there a certain level of sensitivity to the data that you have to consider? Anything of that sort?
Yeah, I mean, from a threat hunting perspective, obviously, the more information you can derive and have at your fingertips, the easier it is to hunt. Just looking at system telemetry, if you have to mask most of the data that is put into a security tool or even put at the access to the security team, then it'll become a lot more difficult for that security team to get to answers if they can't get half of the information. Even just things like looking at file data. Well, if I can't let you even know the name of a file because it might contain a customer's name or an account number, and that could be in the nomenclature of the file itself. So even just looking at basic file telemetry becomes infinitely more complex because I can't get the basic data. So I might be looking for a file that I can't even name, a path I can't even identify on a system, because that data is hidden from me due to its sensitivity and the potential exposure of personally identifiable information and things like that.
I hear that, man. That's absolutely one of the things that we're seeing across the board in the bank. What I'm also finding is different than Layla, if I could add to what Matt has mentioned, is a little bit of understanding the business processes. I find that as cybersecurity professionals, we are not well versed in all aspects of the bank and what various products and services we may offer out, and getting and merging that knowledge, that business knowledge, with the cyber knowledge that we have, it tends to be that big barrier between the works. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And Krish, both you and I come from such huge organizations, and that's always a challenge, right? Covering everything and understanding every single aspect of the business and their needs, and then mapping that to the cybersecurity measures that you're trying to implement, for sure.
Yeah,
I do not envy the position you guys are in. It's leading the space in part of the big five in Canada, it's not easy.
Certainly. And speaking a little bit to that, and Layla, if I may, going into kind of the next kinds of points that we wanted to touch on was about that diverse environment. In the FI industry, we have a number of different environments within the global footprint of the bank. And so can you speak a little bit about hunting in non-production and testing environments, and how would that change your methodology away from the production environment?
Is that to me or Layla?
Yes, that is to you, Matt.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, missed the transfer there, but yeah, no. So I mean, first of all, I think is a blanket statement. I think having hunting in your non-production environment is certainly due to the the speed at which the live environments were moving in financial services, I think is a must. I think being able to replicate some of the systems, some of the operating systems, some of the applications in a test environment, and then being able to put those through testing, do red teaming exercises, purple teaming exercises, understanding where potentially some of your identifiable holes and gaps are is so important. Because if you try and catch up in your live environment, you're always going to be playing from behind. It was, something I spoke about in the keynote, right? You don't want to, we've got to try and take everything we do and move away from chasing the tail. It's be proactive, be ahead of the game as much as you can, and doing some of these things in your non-production environment and preparing and coming up with the plan for the live environment when you do need to get into a threat hunt, being able to identify what was normal helps you identify the anomalies and sets you up for larger success. When it comes to dealing with the actual threat in the live environment, setting yourself up in the non-production is ideal.
Would you have any challenges to hunting in the actual non-production environment, in the sense that we know that testing environments are supposed to be, things aren't supposed to work the way they are in a production environment, exactly because you're testing. So you may have some controls that are a little bit different, some things break. Would you be able to hunt in that kind of environment, or is that just too many variables?
Yeah, no, I think you can. The challenge is always going to be predicting the unpredictable, right? Well, do I know what the next hacker gang is going to plan and what the next target is, and can I predict all of that? I mean, I'm not Nostradamus. I can be good at my job without knowing what's coming next. And
you don't have him on your staff?
We tried to replace him with technology too, and that only went so far. But yeah, so that predictability is really the biggest challenge in the non-production, is because, again, even if you get great red teamers, pen testers, they're only going to do and be able to do what they've known and seen before, and it doesn't necessarily replicate what's going to happen in real life. And then the other challenge is, well, the only way I can replicate exactly what's happening in real life is if I get millions of customers doing billions of transactions in a test environment. Unrealistic to replicate. So it's still important, difficult to really get to all the answers, but it gives you a head start.
That's a great point.
I have one question, Trish, that wasn't in our script that I do want to throw at Matthew. I think it's a simpler one, or at least I hope so. But I did want to, don't hate me for this, but I did want to ask, because we're talking about, detective and preventive measures, is there anything you would give priority to, or is it impossible to have prevention without detection? Can you say, oh, we need, your detection needs to be your priority rather than any of the other controls?
So I'm going to go even more off script. I think the most important part of it is immunization, right? So that it's not quite the same as protection. Protection is still reactive. Mm-hmm. And it's obviously not the same as detection, because that's the utmost. But I think the two that you mentioned, protection and detection, can lead to the third, or can be utilized to accomplish resiliency and immunization, because I think that's the end goal. Protection, I mean, mostly dependent on the known, because you're blocking stuff that you already know can occur or has occurred. And detection is, if it's done wrong, it's reactive, and it's a bad reactive, as I've mentioned a couple of times today. If it's done well, then it might be proactive and useful detection if it's done in real time. But at the end of the day, I want to be as risk adverse as possible, certainly in finance, because got great firefighters in what I've seen on security teams in the financial industry, but you want to be putting out campfires, not forest fires.
Very risk adverse. I'd absolutely mirror that sentiment. And so I have a question for you, Layla. So we're speaking a lot about the Canadian FIs and the financial services industry in general, because that's the theme of the day. But what advice would you have for the other organizations that may be listening in on the audience today, who are curious about developing their in-house threat hunting capabilities? Where do we start?
I mean, the most obvious answer, and occasionally not the most obvious to everybody, is your talent. You need to get the right people in, because we all struggle with that in the industry. There's a significant lack of talent, and I think that we need to find the right people to do this job, rather than kind of trying to fill the hole with whoever we can find. And I think you need to find the right people to do it, and then be very realistic about what your capabilities and resources can do, in the sense of whether you are able to actually do something in-house, or maybe you do need support externally. So I would go with that, to kind of assess what is the best solution for your financial institution, whether it is developing something in-house and creating an in-house team, or if you need external support, and to be very, very realistic about that. Because sometimes what I've noticed is that people get entrenched in their idea, like, oh, it needs to be fully in-house and that's the best for us. And that's not really the case always.
Absolutely. Words of wisdom. Matt, same question to you. From a tools and best practices perspective, where does a burgeoning threat into threat hunting capability begin?
Yeah. So a good friend of mine once told me, they said, Matt, you'd make a horrible car salesman. He said, because if you found out within a couple of seconds of a conversation that the guy actually needed a bike, you're going to give him the bike out of your garage instead of selling him the car. And I think that's how I approach organizations when I do meet with them and I realize that they're trying to build a threat hunting practice, they're trying to improve their security posture, is I start to figure out, Laylee pointed out, what is the talent level? We're in a skills, not a skills problem. We're in a skills void in not just this country, across the planet, in terms of cybersecurity professionals, and more specifically, the ultra, pointed skilled professionals, right? Threat hunters, SOC workers. They are not a dime a dozen. They're not even the two a dozen. They are rare and hard to find. And when you find the best of them, most organizations will pay them a lot of money to stay in-house and not move around. So 2 things is, yes, find technology that helps you, and find organizations that are willing to consult you and step away if their technology isn't going to help you. Walk away from a bad deal. If the technology I'm trying to give you is not going to be a fit, walk away, and realize where you can also consult a company or an organization, or even internally in an organization, come to the realization, hey, we might need to go outside the house for this and deal with experts, because that's the other problem is the big companies are going to get, the 1%. The next 5% are picked up by companies trying to sell you a service. So sometimes you have to dip into that resource and budget differently to get to that. And then learn by shadowing, so that maybe you don't have to constantly be paying for third-party resources. Get your people trained and facilitated either by the technology or the outside service that you're requiring. Don't let it be a lost asset.
Absolutely. Words of wisdom right there. Make sure that you're choosing correctly and assessing what can stay in-house and what can go outside. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, is that if you don't get the talent, they went somewhere else. Maybe it went to that vendor that's knocking on your door. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And I can add to that in the sense that, um, not the top 1% of companies that are currently the biggest names aren't always the best solution for you, or are, based on how the industry is moving and market is moving, may not always be the best solution in general, right? Smaller companies might be developing technologies and have the resources to develop technologies that might be a bit better and a bit more advanced than these names that we are so familiar with. So I would encourage everyone to go out and kind of, shop around and see what the market offers, because there is a lot out of there and there's a lot of smart people out there developing a lot of things.
I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. I have another question. I have a question for you, Trish, because you had mentioned that. So burgeoning threat is fileless malware, which is terrifying, right? I feel like the good old days of getting an attachment on your computer and knowing that's the bad one were the good days, right? Now it's like terrifying. So how have your playbooks evolved to search for these indicators while workers are remote when we talk about fileless malware? And I know that, Trish, that's something that you were looking at particularly. So can you tell us why and what is it exactly that you're looking at?
Absolutely. Fileless malware is a scary thing because a lot of our traditional controls are based off of hash matching and heuristics on the endpoint. And so there's this huge possibility that our traditional controls may not capture the execution of commands on a workstation. And something that we've been really pensive about as a bank, as everybody worked remote, is what kind of awareness do we need to give to our employees when they suspect that something funky is going on their endpoint, on their workstation while they're at home? What is the best practice now? We need to preserve what's in memory at this moment. And so where before we would have told you to shut down, put it in and mail it off to the security team or hand it off to somebody else, maybe that's not the process now, so that we can take a look at what's running in memory that may get lost with a shutdown. And so Really, Matt, this was a complex one. It's a little bit more in the weeds than what we've discussed so far. But what would be your recommendations in detecting some of these from a hunting perspective?
Yeah, from a hunting perspective, and the fileless perspective, I think the security industry in general has done a grave disservice. And being part of obviously a vendor, I'm comfortable saying that. For 30 years, we convinced the world that, when you got a snake bite, focus on the two holes, the puncture wound, where the poison was in your system, right? And we did a fantastic job of solving the problem we could, because it was easy, right? Creating service accounts with an agent that would detect, go through a DAP file full of hashes and signatures and compare that to the database and make detections and eliminate the evil. Well, that was the easiest solution to come up. It was the easiest software to build. So we ignored the poison in the veins and took care of the puncture wound. We've gotten smarter because the hackers forced us to. We've gotten smarter because they stopped using files altogether. They're like, well, we don't even need, that's not a point of entry that's necessary for us anymore, right? Or using a file in a different way, where the file itself isn't the virus, it's an open door. And then that allows me to take advantage of legitimate files that already exist in your environment. I add a little macro, or I make a small modification, and then the file is the least important part of the entire thing. I have to be looking at the processes, the applications that are involved. And so when we look at sort of the fileless world, where we get is, if you've ever seen that pyramid of pain, it's that very top level where hackers are using the tactics and techniques and processes to get after you. And we have to be able to identify those. And that's what you end up hunting for, instead of the easily identifiable file, signature, name, what have you. You're looking for elements of that tactic. So it changes from, I need to know what my users do normally, I need to know what my systems do normally, and I need to have some idea of what hackers normally try and do. So the first two you might be able to do without much help. The third one, threat intelligence, solutions, there's all the resources are out there. You just have to learn how to consume them and utilize them in the right way so you can get ahead.
Is there anything that SentinelOne does differently in this space from the other companies?
So I mean, there's two main things, although some of it is becoming a bit of a standard. Well, I mean, the first is just moving away from file and reputation dependency. I mean, sure, you're going to catch the easy stuff with that, and you should eliminate it right off the get. But we focus on live data analytics and behavior analysis, right? And the key word there is live, autonomous, detection capabilities that is pretty unmatched even in our closest competitors. Whereas recognize something in real time as it's happening, and then the second piece to that is detecting it and being able to hunt it is one piece. Being able to respond to it is the other. So when one of the benefits is, we've talked a little bit about the skill gap, and being able to walk into an organization and say, hey, listen, the solution does most of this for you, including the threat hunting aspects, where we pre-correlate the telemetry, pre-correlate the data, so that by the time one of your SOC workers, one of your threat hunters is sitting in front of the SentinelOne event, half the story is told for them. 100% of the story is told for them. And on top of that, they're no longer firefighting, because built into our solution is how it responds. It remediates automated. It rolls back systems to their pre-attack state without any implication of the security team. And so you're not calling in incident responders. You're not firefighting. You're dealing with pre-correlated data that gets you halfway to the answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's great that you mentioned incident responders, because oftentimes the threat hunting team is also the incident response team. We know that in the FI space, we're big enough here that oftentimes you can separate those responsibilities into folks that respond and then folks that do the hunting. Uh, uh, Layla, I know that TD is famous for its fusion center and something that you guys have integrated a long, long time ago. So, can you speak a little bit about how you facilitate the collaborativeness between these groups in that fusion center, especially now in this work remote situation?
Right. Well, I mean, we did manage to move a lot of things online during the initial period of the pandemic. And I tend to brag about this because TD had, we were very remote and flexible even before. So when the pandemic hit, for example, for my team, it really wasn't a big deal. Essentially, they just told us, stay home, don't come into the office. And that was it, which was great. But we had moved our traders to work from home as well, and just done a lot, like 90,000 people were almost moved to work from home online, right? And that included a part of some of our security operations. And what we have put the focus on is collaboration, exactly as you said. So the Fusion Center is one of those spaces where we have tried integrating as many of those areas into one to make sure that people are in one physical space, communicating, talking to each other, from the forensics team to our SOC operations, so that they're all communicating and they're there in one space. Now, because we are a global institution and people can be in that space 24/7, we do have a sundown approach so that we can kind of track activity as the sun goes around the planet, right? Which I think is always very cool and a very cool concept. And that's what we try to do. We just try to foster collaboration and very clear roles and responsibilities, because these concepts of like SOC, incident responders, threat hunting, sometimes it gets a little bit nebulous and kind of messy, and you don't really know who does what. And in an organization that doesn't coordinate this well and doesn't have this clearly lined out, it can be an issue. So having a clear delineation of responsibilities and roles and good collaboration, ideally in the same physical space, I think that really, really does help.
Yeah, yeah. No, great points all around. Matt, on your side, what are some of those key collaborative pieces that you want these teams to be working on together, and how do you facilitate effective communication?
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with what you guys have said thus far. It's, I mean, ideally, if they could be one team, and maybe you can have the different skill sets there, but one team would be ideal. But in larger organizations, it's both a benefit and a curse almost. But the benefit is you get to have a larger staff with, hopefully more diverse skill sets and expertise. But that's when those collaborative pieces really gain importance. I almost like if you look at it from a nation defense scenario, right? Some of the biggest incidents in the defense of war and nations is when the intelligence side doesn't communicate properly with the tactical side, and that's how I think of it, right? The threat hunters, they're the intelligence side. The SOC teamers, the incident responders, they're more of the tactical side. And if there's, if they withhold information or don't communicate, or, one team is seeing something that the other isn't, well, then you can be in a scenario where you've probably, I mean, the biggest disadvantage probably ends up being with the tactical team, because they're having to respond to things blindly without knowing, or they're responding to more incidents because the incident perhaps could have been prevented altogether. So, it's a matter of definitely communication is a big piece, but sharing tools. I've dealt with organizations where the two teams have each paid for their own, as an example, threat intelligence service. So one team is getting a completely different feed than the other, probably similar information when you really boiled it down, but one, you're paying double, and two, one team is reacting perhaps differently than another. And, one team is strategic, the other one's tactical. So the strategic team is trying to, create controls, while the other, and you can combine the two, get cohesive tools. There are security solutions, technologies out there. Like, I'll just throw in an example of like a SIM that is built to help all the different areas of a security operations collaborate, make it work.
Mm-hmm.
They can be configured wrong and become more of a burden, but if they're configured right, that's a catalyst to better, just one example of a catalyst to better collaboration.
That's awesome. That can be our tagline for this section of it. It will be communication plus consolidation equals collaboration. So it's kind of it's a triple C threat on that end. So great points. Thank you.
Sorry, when you mentioned the different teams within the same company are using different tools, that just gave me so much anxiety right there. It's like, oh boy, that sounds like such a nightmare. Oof. But one of the issues that are kind of, it's a perennial issue in any sort of monitoring and logging, any sort at any level, right? Is the amount of logs that are captured. And I know that I often talk to, I talk to companies and I would say, well, okay, how do you monitor this? And they're like, we don't. There's so many things, Or I'm like, how long do you store these logs? And they'll say, oh, we can't store them for long because there's just so much of them. So it almost become useless because they're storing so many of them. They're not going through them, and alerts and events can only take you so far, because what if something slips by? So do you have a solution for that, Matt? Do you have a solution for this issue of just so many logs being generated and then important events being missed?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I, I'm sure you guys are more even familiar with it than I am. But if you've ever looked at an active Windows server log, forget it. Like, by the time you siphon through the data looking for that pinpoint object, you really is going to define your threat hunt or your anomaly is going to be very difficult. So it comes back to that combination of people and technology. I've said it, and I joked with when we spoke earlier this morning. We're an EDR vendor, and I say it to tons of customers, and I say it internally. EDR as a technology in general has almost created more problems than it has created a fix to the challenge. And the reason why is exactly what we've just discussed there. It's the amount of data, the amount of log data, the amount of telemetry. If you're lacking even the slightest bit of skill, it becomes unbearable. If the solution does not help you in some way to categorize, contextualize, correlate, then you're almost working for nothing. I mean, the constant joke I made is, we created these computers to do something we couldn't, right? They can crunch data significantly faster than any human being I have ever met or heard of. So we've got to have them, use the technology in its place to collect that data, but then put it in a consumable format that allows the people aspect to, take that data and do something effective with it. Just dumping data is useless. I'll never stop saying that. It's dumping context on people. Stop dumping data, dump context on people. People can deal with context. People can deal with a story. Data is irrelevant. There's just too much of it. When you look at the speed, the velocity, the volume, and the 3 V's there or whatever it is, it's overwhelming. So you have to use the combination of technology and a little bit of skill to get past that element.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that's been effective in managing the volume of logs on our side is really data categorization and prioritization prior to building out your response playbooks. And so not all logs are created equal, right?
Right.
And it's something that we need to ensure that everybody really understands, from everyone from the application developer to the security architect, all the way to the team that ingests this data, and all the way to the team that responds to it, right? The logs that give you the information that may give you a hint that something may be going on may need to go into your SIM, and you store that data so that you can create correlation rules around it. But the logs, when you're investigating something that you're already aware of and that you're looking for, may be separate. They may sit in a different data lake. They may sit in a different repository. And so prioritize, categorize, and feed into the technologies the most relevant kind of data to allow your teams to be alerted and then investigate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we talked a little bit about that alert fatigue, and you mentioned
Mhm.
EDR. You're picking on EDRs as a self kind of reflective occurrence, but there are other new sexy technologies that are out there that I'm sure everybody's CEO has seen a PowerPoint presentation about and said, "Why don't we have this in our network?" One of those things that we've started to see, and we're kind of watching the maturity of right now, is deceptive technologies. Now, from my end, I think that hunting and deceptive technologies go hand in hand, but it runs the risk of that same alert fatigue of too many logs. What level of maturity would you say, Matt, does an organization require before we even start thinking about honeypots and all of that fun stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be almost a little bit repetitive, but one of the things I tell, whether it's customers or my buddies who run IT departments of companies, and it's, don't let your maturity dictate technology. The opposite, right? Find technology that fits your maturity. So if you take it from that perspective, deceptive technology, honeypots, all the sandboxing that we've been using for years, because that technology can be of great use or it can be somewhat passive at best, right? Find me a hacker that doesn't know how to bypass even the best sandbox on the planet. You're not going to find many. They all know how to do it. You can go to any dark web browser and Google, like their equivalent of Google it, and you're going to figure out how to deceive a sandbox, right? So where the maturity comes in is not, can I use the technology, is maybe I need some assistance in putting the technology in place in the way that it can be useful to me. So helping your teams understand that, okay, if I'm putting honeypots in place, if I'm going to have all my emails siphoned through a sandbox, well, if I'm going to have people, impatiently wait, 2 seconds for an email to be sent from one person to another, then I better be able to have that 2 seconds matter, right? And so when the data comes in, either the most mature companies don't care because the data will come in and the smart guy in the room can look at it and go, no, that's a false positive. It's, user X is just doing something that otherwise could be very similar to what a hacker would do.
Mhm.
They're not, they're just doing their job. Or I get technology that is a little bit more sophisticated and can do part of that for me, or there's a team behind it that's doing part of that for you. But then it becomes, once you want that high end where you're doing very little and somebody else is doing a lot, the cost goes up. So cheapest is you have the smart guy in house. Next cheapest is technology does a lot of the work for you and you can put it in place with little pain. Most expensive is you got the complex technology and a service on top of it that's doing all the work for you, but then you're going to pay. So, there's no easy answer to it. I think deceptive technology is key. We've built it into what we do at Sentinel One, right? Part of our anti-tamper engine, part of what keeps our agent itself from being attacked is we've built deception into it. We want the hacker to think they've won when the agent's actually in the background going, okay, nice try, bud. We're going to keep watching what you do so that I can inform the analyst looking at the screen what you just did, but you didn't win. We won. We just collected your data. Thanks. Because that's what deception technology should actually do. It should tell you what the hacker was trying to do, what they were trying to accomplish, and give you that story so that it doesn't happen to you more than once. But there's challenges around it. You just got to figure it out.
Absolutely. Layla, I'm not sure if it's something that you guys currently use at TD or something that's in the roadmap for you. Deceptions often can be, as Matt said, it can be a technology or it can be somebody's job, right? Where are
Yeah.
you guys in terms of doing that?
I don't think I can tell you. I don't think I'm allowed to tell you. But I will say, I said this during our morning call, is that sometimes I feel like deception technology is like then the, unauthorized access forbidden sign. for hackers, in the sense of like, yeah, that hasn't stopped anyone ever, right? And the false positives are definitely an issue. But leading into sort of false positives and related to that, now that we're coming out of this experimental year and a half that feels like, somebody threw a curveball at us, and this pandemic, and the fact that everybody has moved to work from home. Matt, you had mentioned that you use behavioral analysis at SentinelOne. And a lot of that is based on kind of predictability and knowing how employees act and kind of having some sort of patterns there. How has this work from home pandemic year affected your case studies, use cases, scenarios? Because suddenly you have a whole workforce where everything's up in the air. People are running after dogs, kids, fire alarms are going off, people are logging in all hours of the day. Has that been difficult, or has caused you to make any changes to the product?
I mean, yeah, in certain ways it has, because I think the challenge that has been presented now is, there was two type of controls, back when everybody was working out of a four-walled building, or maybe there was more than four walls, but out of a building with a desk and a computer and a network. Maybe it plugged in, maybe it didn't. That was irrelevant, but it was controlled in that environment. I could also see people, right? There was funny enough, another little piece of, added security where, hey, the guy sitting next to you, if he sees you doing something really weird, might report you. So that aspect is gone, because now everybody's working in the privacy of their own home, which you mentioned some of the chaos, right? I've definitely had my 2.5-year-old run in the middle of a meeting, put her fist on the keyboard, and what happens, like there's a certain amount of chaos. We know that hackers thrive on chaos. The second element is, it's all the other things that are out of my control, right? I told you this, guys, this morning when this all started, right? I had 2 children on school Zooms and things like that, so bandwidth is getting used. There's tons of stuff on my home network that's almost inevitable, and the big joke is, well, oh, so you must have your home network segregated for like the business use. And no, I can't even go in and manipulate my Bell router that much, right? So it's, now I'm not worried about, well, okay, I've got the corporate asset, it's on a private network and all these things. It's, no, that corporate asset, I patched all of that, there's nothing vulnerable there, but it's on the same network as a TV, iPhones, Android phones, coffee makers, everything is network connected now. So I'm no longer worried about my corporate asset. I'm worried about the 10 other things that are also simultaneously connected to that. And 10 is a low number as far as I'm concerned, right? And then there's the aspect of, I walked my dog the other day and I turned on the Bluetooth of my phone just to see how many devices I could connect to of my neighbors. Walking down the street, and I won't name names, but there's an executive at a financial institution that lives on my street. Want to guess whether I could connect Bluetooth to their machine or not? I could. Yeah. So this is what we have to be worried about now. And you said, well, what did we do at SentinelOne? Well, one of the technologies we have is called Ranger. And Ranger basically uses the agent we deploy on the machine to detect its ARP table neighbors, its network neighbors, so you can see if there's anything anomalous on the network, right? And then potentially block those unwanted elements from your corporate assets. So I discover a TV, on the same network as one of my corporate assets. I can click on that TV and say, you know what? Block that IP address from communicating with anything in my corporate asset, right? So I had one customer say, well, Matt, that's going to be discovering all kinds of stuff, and I don't know what so I said, well, you're going to have to make a choice between what your employees are choosing to put on their network and whether you're going to know about that, and how exposed your corporate asset is. Because if they're unpatched, zero intelligence TV OS is on the same network as your very expensive bank software, very expensive, patching and everything else, the SolarWinds example, a very expensive software, everything from the government to every bank in the world, every hospital in the world is using this technology, and it was a gaping hole. So, those are easy things to fix because I can just rip SolarWinds off my network. I can't have Matt replace his TV at home. That's not something that's within my control. So what we did technology wise was put the controls back onto the asset and have it blocking the other connections.
Yeah. And Chris, if you don't mind, now that we have this focus a little bit more on the product and SentinelOne, back to the challenge statement of, a financial institution registering a cyber attack and key controls being given over to hackers. Can you outline, because we don't have a lot of time, we have some questions waiting for us, but if you could outline in just a couple of steps, what is it that you would do? What is it that the product would do in order to mitigate this kind of cyber attack?
So the beauty of it is the solution will do more. When I read that challenge statement, I'm like,
so what you're saying is you're not going to do anything. You're just going to click a button.
Yeah.
That's it.
The guys running SentinelOne are sleeping at night when that happens. No, somewhat joking. Obviously, there's some tremendous complexity, and when a cyber attack happens, regardless of what technology you have in place, it's a challenge. But what I think we do a little bit differently, and I spoke about some of it, is one, detection comes in. It's not going to be a singular event. It's going to be an event I can build off and help to immunize my organization. So the first part is identifying the event, identifying the elements of the event, which is all using what we call our storyline technology. And then built upon that technology, utilize the other tools, our automated remediation, which is, hopefully if it's in an active mode, what we call our protect mode, it's going to have already, one, stopped the attack in progress. It's going to add rules to putting stuff on the blacklist, looking at the behavior analytics, and build that case to immunize and add resiliency, at the same time responding in real time using that technology. And if you do have to get into the threat hunt, taking from that singular event to a correlated query across your entire environment is one click, not 20 pivots. I have a buddy who's in incident response, and I showed him what we do with SentinelOne, and I said, okay, before I tell you how long it's going to take me to get from I've resolved the incident, I've immunized the entire environment, and I know how many other assets were affected, how long does it take you when you walk into a customer and do that? He goes, well, probably the better part of 2 days at $800 to $1,000 an hour. And I went, okay, watch this. And he said, please never show any of my customers that. Good news is we have a lot of common customers. So he presents that technology, and it's a good story for everyone. But I think that's where we differentiate ourselves. It's pre-building in that context and response really sets us apart, so that you're not responding the way that challenge statement was, where the incident happens and then the threat hunt and the response are something separate from the alert and the protection. It's all part of one cohesive motion to get it done.
Yeah, they say that the worst time to prepare for an emergency is during one, and I think what we're all saying across the board here, across the 3 different organizations that we all represent, would be that we need to really focus before an incident happens, before anything else happens, focusing on our talent, their capabilities, the technologies in front of them, and how much work is hitting them in the face all day long. Someone once said to me that incident response is like driving the wrong way on a highway. You're gonna get hit, you just don't know when. And so it's just a matter of being prepared for that hit. So thank you guys so much. We do have questions. Thank you for bringing that subject up, Layla. And so why don't we start with the very first one, which is something that I think a lot of FIs are concerned about, especially with some news that came out in like 2019, 2020. What controls would you recommend to protect against insider threats?
Insider threats and outsider threats are not that different in nature. The end goal is it will produce behavior on your system, whether it's the guy sitting 2 desks over from you who's accessed the network is doing something they probably shouldn't, or someone who's breached you from the outside. The end result is they're going to get to your endpoints, they're going to get to your network, they're going to get to your systems, they're going to get to your applications. And so the final battleground is that endpoint activity, and being able to tell the difference between when that activity is normal, or normal with no risk, or normal with risk and potentially some malicious behavior, or just full-blown malicious anomalous behavior is really important, because it's no chance when and where that attack's going to come from.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
focusing back into the technology piece, do you guys do the role-based behavioral monitoring and modeling of what a normal role will do?
You can, and part of that is policy setting. Part of that is what we would, with our technology, we call rule setting, but different technologies have different names for it, but we call it star rules. It's being able to say, okay, this group of machines that I've identified, they might be using this application, or they might have this type of access, or this type of activity on their machines. Whereas this group, if I see that, it's a problem, because that's not part of their normal activity. Their systems shouldn't be, an easy example, someone who's not an administrator on their machine, is not one of the power users in your organization, shouldn't be accessing PowerShell or the shell of their machine, and all of a sudden they are, and they're doing it repeatedly, and spawning other processes from that. That's easy. I can build a rule and say, based on that profile,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to identify that as malicious, whereas for the other group it wasn't.
Yeah,
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 I
and
think,
kind of. Sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
even before we get that to that level of identifying any sort of anomalous activity, for me the focus is always on access. And I like to remind everybody, because often we focus on those external threats and kind of, North Korea is going to hack me, Russia's going to hack me. I'm like, well, what if your buddy on your team wakes up one morning and is enraged at the company and at you and decides to do something? What are the ways that we can stop our own people from doing the wrong things? And it always comes back to access and making sure that you do have that separation of duty, and that people are not able to escalate their access and privileges. And that's just one step in order to stop them before we need to start hunting them and detecting them.
Yeah. A quick story on that note, just to finish off this point, is, we're talking about insider threats. I talked about our Ranger technology, and it's not to harp on it, but we had a customer and they couldn't figure out, but a lot of their data was ending up, on the dark web and with some of their competitors, and all like, it was a really bad situation, and they could not figure out, because looking at firewall logs, there's no weird transactions or traffic or connections or anything like that. So it didn't seem possible that somebody from the outside was, collecting the data from, outside. And then, USBs are locked down. How can you transport the data otherwise? So they couldn't figure it out. So we turn on Ranger, and immediately it discovers I won't name the manufacturer, but I find out, okay, here's all this brand router and this brand switches appearing on your network. And they go, we don't use that technology anymore. We decommissioned that 2 years ago. And I went, oh, well, no, I can tell you 100% it is on your network. And I said, well, I can actually tell you that the agent that's detecting it is neighbors. So there's only one computer actually on that VLAN that technology is running, and it's this computer here. He goes, well, actually, I know who that belongs to, and that is not supposed to be on any other network. And so it was quite easy for us to figure out that the insider threat had actually built their own network inside the environment and had built access to a lot of the servers. So some of the times the biggest threat is somebody that's working on your IT and security team. So,
Oh boy.
Wow. I'm like,
I know. I'm sitting here being like, really?
yeah.
We're just getting to that now.
it happens. Scary stuff.
On the topic of threat modeling and the insider perspective of it, I think a lot of threat intel teams and hunting capabilities are aware of the maturity model of the threat actors that we tout a lot in a lot of presentations, and we talk about at a broad level. Someone in the audience had a question about whether or not your hunting techniques will vary from identifying a threat actor as an advanced threat actor, or perhaps some commodity type of adversary. Does that change your playbook, or is it all the same?
It changes the playbook. It probably changes how easy it is to hunt, but I don't think it changes your playbook. What I have often said to organizations is assume the worst. assume you're up against APT29. Assume you're up against, the guys that built Hafnium. Assume you're up against the worst of the worst. Assume you're, happen to fall, certainly in financial services. Assume you happen to fall on the radar of, the common culprits, right? Nation state guys who are very dangerous, very advanced. And it's not just advanced individuals. It's, as big as your staff is, imagine a room of that many hackers all working together and assume that's what you're up against. And the only difference will be if your playbook stays the same, you find the commodity guys real quick and you deal with them even quicker. The advanced guys are both going to be harder to get to the final answer, and unfortunately even harder to build that resiliency and immunization against.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I feel that same sentiment from my end. It is a lot easier to ask for forgiveness than permission in general, and that goes with responding to incidents. I would rather have been overcautious and over prepared, and oh, that rather than say, oh, we thought it was nothing, and therefore we reacted in this way, and really allow that to validate it. So that very conservative mindset of think the worst, especially if you're an FI, especially if you're a Canadian FI. And I believe all the top 5 banks in Canada are all global, right? And so this makes it for a very, very wide footprint. You got a big target on your backs. I don't know if Layla, if you have any other comments on that.
I absolutely agree. And we're talking about conservative approach. Of course, you have to be incredibly cautious, because what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario here isn't, oh, my small or medium sized business goes out of business, and a couple of people lose their jobs. You could collapse the whole economic system. And I was reading something recently about how all of the kind of the top 6 companies on Wall Street, the top 6 banks, including the Fed chairman, all identified cybersecurity as the main risk and the main thing they're looking at going forward. And what they had made a comment about, and I think this is very accurate, is that we need to make more of an effort in Canada to be working together. So Scotia and TD and BMO and everyone, because we have a mutual responsibility to a whole market and a whole system. So that goes perfectly in line with, yes, let's be very, very conservative, because our threats are also not, Matt with a hoodie in his basement doing something. You could have, the Russian GRU unit looking at you. You could have these incredibly advanced threats that are looking to collapse the whole country. So, Trish, I think we need to come together and figure out how to protect the whole system rather than just individual businesses.
Absolutely, and I think with some of the circles that we run in already, a lot of the FIs speak very, very frequently. I know that we're on calls with them every single week, and so we're working together to make sure that we understand these threats, and that we're sharing whatever intelligence we may find on our side. Final question for everyone, a little bit more on the technical side just before we wrap up here. Someone from the audience had a quick question about the ideal log formats for aggregation. Is there something that saves space in the event that, you don't have a lot of hot storage in place?
Right. So, there's the storage and technical aspects, which, I come back to my shot against our own technology, not specifically our technology, but EDR and security tools in general. They can generate a lot of logs. And in fact, if I look at some of the solutions, they make you pay for it. So, in terms of make sure that the data that at least you're going to try and store long-term or consume long-term is only the important stuff. And the only way you get to that is, through getting it to a story format as quickly as possible, a usable format as quickly as possible, and making sure that whatever storage or consumption model you have, it is most effective. The example I give, and it works from kids all the way up, right? If I say bear tree bee, you're going, okay, that's 3 things. If I go bear wearing a red shirt, maple tree, honeybee with a hive, you're going, okay, I'm starting to get it. If I go, the bear's name is Winnie the Pooh. He lives in a tree. He loves honey. There's a bee that's built a hive right above him, and he's really hungry and he's going to eat that honey. Which can you more easily consume? Me, 3 uncontextualized, no idea elements to, okay, a little bit more to the full story is built for me. If I only store that story, I'm way ahead of the game. So aggregate before you store is one idea. Contextualize before you store is really how you get to the most efficiency.
And with that, I think we are at time. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us, Matt, Layla. Thank you guys so much for joining us here today. There's been a few things that we've come out of this panel for and discussed, and hopefully was helpful to everybody in the audience. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.